Welcome to another deep dive. We're going to be exploring the idea of legacy, especially through the lens of faith. We've got some lectures here from Pastor Sing Fa, and I have to say, I'm pretty fascinated by his take on this whole thing.
Well, you know what really grabs me is how Pastor Tsing ties this whole leaving a spiritual inheritance thing, legacy,
Yeah.
to the very real struggles that churches are facing, like right now.
Yeah, he doesn't shy away from the tough stuff. Not at all. He talks about churches struggling with too many programs, not enough volunteers, and a real lack of clear leadership, which, I think a lot of us have seen that. And then there's that point he makes about disciple training, or really the lack of it. He's traveled with his wife to over 100 cities, and he's noticed these patterns everywhere. It's not just like one isolated thing.
And, it's that widespread observation that leads him to this powerful image. The church as a ship. He even says flat out the church is in trouble. He asks, if people are abandoning ship like this, what does that say about the ship itself? Like, what kind of shape are we in?
It's such a strong image. Really makes you think. If we're picturing the church as this ship, are we, I don't know, are we taking on water? Are we even going the right way? Are we equipped to handle the rough seas?
It makes you wonder,
Yeah.
right? And Pascal Ching's point is the problems the church is going through, they aren't just because of like pressure from outside or culture changing. He's saying it's something deeper, a real crisis of faith that starts, well, in the human heart. And he uses Romans 1.5 where it talks about faith and obedience. Real faith isn't just knowing the right thing to do, it's actually living it out.
And that brings to mind the specific challenges he talks about, like that lack of disciple training we mentioned. It's not just about filling up the seats, right? It's about equipping people to actually live out their faith in a real and powerful way. Because otherwise, how can we expect this ship to stay afloat, let alone reach where it's supposed to go?
He suggests we need to focus on this idea of disciple training, but not just in the way we usually think about it. It's something, well, more profound.
Okay, yeah. Now I'm really interested. So how does he define this disciple training, and how does that connect to navigating this whole ship metaphor?
Well, he dives into Psalm 73 to show us three really important life lessons that form the basis for this active faith he keeps talking about. And these lessons actually become the blueprint for how he trains disciples.
I see. And those lessons are, I'm not too familiar with Psalm 73, to be honest.
Well, it's a really interesting psalm. It starts with the author kind of grappling with something I think a lot of us can relate to, seeing all the bad stuff happening in the world and asking, why do bad things happen to good people? The author sees bad people getting ahead, and it makes him wonder if it's even worth it to try and do what's right. Does that resonate with you at all?
Oh, yeah, definitely. I think we've all had times where we wonder if it even matters if we do the right thing.
Yeah.
But where does the psalmist and I guess Pastor Chang go from there?
Going through all of that, the psalmist comes to three important insights. First, he realizes it's super important to evaluate life with the right perspective. It's easy to get caught up comparing yourself to others, to see how successful they look from the outside and feel bad about yourself. But Pastor Jane reminds us that true fulfillment comes from lining up with God's values, not the world's.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
It's not about being successful in the world's eyes. It's about living a life that's actually good in God's eyes. What's the second lesson?
The second lesson is all about having the right desires. He tells this kind of funny story about a guy who's way more upset about maybe losing his dog than about his dad maybe dying. It really highlights how we can easily get our priorities mixed up, putting temporary stuff above what really matters.
Wow. Yeah, that's a powerful picture. I don't think a lot of people can relate to that, even if it's not about a pet. We often find ourselves chasing after things that won't truly satisfy us in the end.
Exactly. And, those misplaced desires, they have a direct impact on the legacy we build. If we're always focused on getting stuff or chasing fleeting pleasure, what kind of spiritual inheritance are we leaving behind?
Okay, so the first lesson is about perspective. The second is about our desires. What's the third thing the psalmist learns?
The third, and maybe the most important lesson, is all about building the right hope. The psalmist finds comfort not in how things are going in this world, but in God's promise to always be there and be faithful. And this is where Pastor Cheng's idea of disciple training starts to take shape.
I'm starting to see the connection. So it's not just about outward behavior or religious stuff. It's about having a change deep down inside that comes from having the right perspective, wanting the right things, and having a hope that's rooted in God. So that's what he means by disciple training.
You got it. It's about going beyond just head knowledge and moving into actually living out your faith. where what you believe actually shapes what you do, the choices you make, and ultimately the legacy you leave.
It's like he's saying if we want the church, the ship, to stay afloat, we got to make sure the crew has a strong foundation. And that foundation is built on a true understanding of God, a desire for the things that really matter, and a hope that can handle any storm.
Exactly. And that's where his four-step process for disciple training comes in.
Okay, now I'm really hooked. Tell me about this process. It sounds like this could be the key to not only making our own faith stronger, but also bringing new life to the church as a whole. So we're ready to hear about Pastor Singh's four-step process for disciple training. You were saying this process is really important for equipping the crew of our ship, the church, to handle whatever comes their way.
It's huge, yeah. And what's really cool is he talks about these steps in a way that's not just about growing yourself, but also about, having an impact on others. It's like you don't just learn for yourself, but that knowledge, it's supposed to change you, and then you share that change with other people.
So it's like a ripple effect, right? Where your growth, it spreads out and touches everyone around you. Okay, take me through those steps. What's the first one?
The first step is all about discovering truth. But it goes deeper than just reading the Bible or hearing sermons. It's about really digging into Scripture, wrestling with what it teaches, and figuring out how it applies to your life.
So he wants us to really engage with our faith, not just kind of passively take in information. He wants us to think hard about what we believe and why.
Exactly. He really emphasizes how important it is to ask questions, to really seek understanding, and to dig deeper into those passages we think we know.
So not blind faith, but informed faith.
Okay.
I like that. What's the next step in the process?
The second step is applying truth. Now, this is where we go from just knowing something in our heads to really having it change our hearts. It's about taking what we've learned and putting it into practice in our everyday lives.
So this is where the rubber meets the road, huh? It's where we bridge that gap between knowing the right thing and actually doing it.
Exactly. And this is where the concepts of chronos and kairos come in, which we touched on earlier. Pastor Sang explains that chronos, that's like our regular clock time, minutes and hours and days. But kairos, that's a different kind of time. It's more like a moment of opportunity, a God-given time to act.
Okay, so chronos is the ticking clock, and kairos is more like a special moment, a chance to make a difference. But how does this all connect to applying truth?
Well, Pastor Sang's point is when we actually try to live out the truths we've discovered, we become more in tune with those kairos moments, those special opportunities to put our faith into action.
Oh, I see. So by living intentionally, by trying to make our actions match our beliefs, we start noticing those moments where we can really have an impact.
Exactly. It's like we're training ourselves to see those kairos moments and seize them, to step out in faith and let God work through us.
That's a powerful concept. It's not just about knowing what to do, but about being ready to act when the chance comes. What's the third step in this process?
The third step is reaping the benefits. This is where you start experiencing the real power of living out your faith. It's about seeing the results of your obedience, the good changes that happen in your life and in the lives of people around you.
It's not about following rules to try and earn God's favor or anything like that. It's about experiencing that real joy and fulfillment that comes from living the way he wants us to.
Right. Pastor Cheng makes it clear that true faith isn't supposed to be a burden. It's a source of life, joy, and purpose.
And that reminds me of the ship image again. If we're focused on giving the crew a deep and active faith, it's not just about keeping the ship from sinking. It's about giving them the power to sail towards a destination of joy and fulfillment.
Okay, so we've got discovering truth, applying truth, and reaping the benefits. What's the last step in this process?
The fourth step is passing it on. This is where we move from being the ones receiving discipleship to becoming the disciple makers. You share what you've learned, you mentor others, and help them grow in their faith. So the cycle keeps going, like that ripple effect we talked about, where your faith spreads outward and touches other lives. And ultimately, it helps the whole church become healthier and more alive.
Yeah, that's it. Pastor Seng's saying, if we want the church, our ship, to really thrive, we can't just focus on keeping ourselves afloat. We got to equip others to navigate too.
This whole process is really making me think. It's like he's giving us a map, not just for surviving in our faith, but for thriving in it, and then helping others do the same.
And it's fascinating how he ties this back to what he was saying earlier about the state of the church. He says that if we want to fix the problems that are making people leave, we need to change our focus from keeping up programs to equipping people.
I'm starting to see the big picture now. It's not about fancy programs or buildings. It's about investing in the spiritual growth of individuals and then giving those individuals the power to go out and make a difference.
He's basically saying the solution isn't more programs, it's more disciples.
So how does he suggest we develop this kind of deep, active faith that leads to real disciple-making? What are the practical steps involved in shifting from being program-focused to people-focused?
Well, this is where his own story comes in. He shares a really powerful anecdote about a time when he was wrestling with his own ambitions, his own desires for success.
You mean the story about when he was 21 and prayed to change the world, and God told him he had to stay unsung for 20 years?
That's the one. It's a turning point in his life because it makes him confront his ego, his desire for recognition and achievement.
I bet that was a tough thing to hear, especially at that age. But how does that connect to this bigger idea of disciple training and revitalizing the church?
That's a really good question, and I think that's a perfect place to pick up after a break. You know where we left off? It's a turning point for him because it makes him shift his focus from outward success to inner transformation. He realizes that real impact, it starts with having a strong foundation, one that's rooted in humility, obedience, and a deep understanding of what God wants.
Yeah, so instead of chasing fame or recognition, he had to surrender his own ambitions and trust in God's plan.
Yeah.
That couldn't have been easy, but it sounds like it led him to a much more, I don't know, authentic and impactful life.
Definitely. And he uses this to explain a really key idea from Matthew 7, where Jesus is talking about the wise man who builds his house on the rock, and you've got the foolish man who builds on the sand.
Oh, yeah, the parable of the wise and foolish builders. It's all about, the importance of having a solid foundation that can stand up to the storms. How does he connect that parable to his own experience and to disciple training?
He says that, so often we get caught up in building the superstructure of our lives, our careers, achievements, how we look to other people. But we don't pay enough attention to the foundation. He realized, through what he went through, that lasting impact comes from putting the unseen work first. Character development, spiritual growth, that deep relationship with God.
So it's not just about learning more or adding new skills. It's about developing the inner qualities that help us go through hard times and make a real difference.
Exactly. He even asks the listener this question: are you focusing on the superstructure of your life at the expense of the foundation?
Wow. That's something to think about. Am I sometimes too focused on, achievements instead of inner change? How do we make sure we're building on a solid foundation? What are some practical things we can do to cultivate that inner strength?
Well, he doesn't stop at theory. He gives us some real guidance. He uses powerful examples and vivid illustrations to get his points across. One of the most striking examples is the story of the Titanic.
The Titanic. What does a luxury ocean liner have to do with leaving a legacy of faith?
He zeroes in on this one detail: a survivor who, the ship's going down, there's chaos everywhere, and he chooses to grab 3 oranges instead of valuables from his room. It's a weird choice, right? But it shows us a deep truth about what really matters when everything else is taken away.
Okay, now I'm really curious. So it's not about holding on to material things or achievements, but about seeing what will actually sustain us when things get tough.
That's it. It's about putting first the things that feed our souls, the things that give us true strength, things like faith, hope, love, and connection with God.
It makes you wonder, with the challenges the church is facing today, if we're so worried about programs and how things look, are we missing those really essential things that keep us going?
That's a good point. Pastor Sang would say we need to shift our priorities. We need to focus on developing those inner qualities that will equip us to go through tough times and come out stronger.
So how do we actually make that shift? How do we go from focusing on the outside to the inside, from programs to people?
He has a lot of practical suggestions from his own life and from the Bible. He warns us about being hypocrites, about fooling ourselves, and about straying from God's path. He says it's important to live intentionally, to see our spiritual journey not as just drifting along, but as a focused pursuit.
Like in that story about his scuba diving training, right?
Huh.
He got distracted by the pretty bubbles and ended up drifting off course, almost went into dangerous territory.
Exactly. He compares that to how easily we can get off track in our faith, pulled away from our purpose by comfort or distractions or chasing after things that don't really matter.
So how do we stay on course? How do we avoid getting lost in the metaphorical bubbles and make sure we're headed in the right direction?
He talks about this idea of Christianity as a supernatural adventure. He's emphasizing the need for an active, engaged faith, one that embraces the unknown and trusts God to lead the way.
I really like this idea of faith being an adventure. It's So much more exciting than just rules and rituals.
Hmm.
But how do we actually live out this supernatural adventure? What does that look like in everyday life?
He gives us three key lessons: learning to be still even when we're busy, finding wisdom in all the knowledge we gather, and searching for truth by being authentic.
Those are some great guidelines. It's so easy to get caught up in the busyness of life, to chase knowledge just for the sake of it,
Mm.
and to show the world this perfect version of ourselves. But how do those lessons translate into building a lasting legacy?
He says a life that's marked by stillness, wisdom, and authenticity, it draws other people to the source of that life. It becomes a living example of how powerful faith can be.
It's not just what we say, but how we live. It's about truly living out the things we believe and letting those truths shine outward and impact the people around us.
And he tells this really touching story about encouraging his daughter, even though she was failing in school. It's a beautiful example of how powerful it is to believe in someone and to be positive. He focused on her effort, on her willingness to keep trying, and saw her potential even when her grades didn't show it.
That's a powerful reminder. We all know someone who needs that kind of encouragement, that belief that they can do it, even when they're struggling. It's about looking beyond what we see on the surface and recognizing the value and the potential in each person.
And he ties this story to the spiritual principles of sowing and reaping. He emphasizes that our actions, good and bad, have a ripple effect that goes far beyond the moment. He talks about praying for his wife's grandmother's salvation for years. He's highlighting how important it is to trust God's timing.
It reminds us that even if the results don't come when we want them to, it doesn't mean our efforts were wasted. We need to keep being faithful in those small things, knowing that even the smallest acts of kindness, generosity, and love can have a big impact on others.
And that's where legacy takes on this deeper meaning. It's not just about what we do while we're here. It's about the seeds we plant, the lives we touch, and the impact of our faith that keeps spreading even after we're gone.
And finally, he talks about those inevitable wilderness experiences we all go through in our faith. He uses the example of an art critic who has to get down on his knees to really see a painting, showing that our perspective shapes how we understand things.
It's a really cool metaphor for how our attitude towards life, being humble and willing to see things differently, can completely change how we see the world.
And he connects that to those times of trial, uncertainty, even despair that everyone faces. He shares about getting lost in the African wilderness with his wife. And it highlights how important it is to trust God, even when you feel completely lost.
He reminds us that these wilderness experiences, they're not meant to break us. They're meant to make us stronger, to make us rely on God more, and to get us ready for what's ahead. It's in those difficult times that our faith is really tested, our character is shaped, and we find a strength inside ourselves that we didn't even know was there.
So to wrap up this deep dive into Pastor Singh's lectures, what do you think is the most important takeaway for our listeners?
I think the main message is that building a lasting legacy means changing our focus. It's not about maintaining programs, it's about equipping people. It's about growing a deep, authentic faith that changes us from the inside out and then empowers us to go out and make a difference in the world. It's about understanding that the church isn't a building or an organization, but a community of people called to show Christ's love and grace.
I completely agree. And that message is so relevant to the challenges the church is facing today. If we want this ship to keep sailing, we need to make sure the crew has the spiritual tools and resources to weather the storms.
And he reminds us, even when things get tough, even when we feel lost, God is with us. He's guiding us, and he's working everything out for our good. He encourages us to hold on to hope, to trust in his faithfulness, and to never underestimate the power of those small acts of obedience and love.
So to our listeners, we encourage you to think about your own idea of legacy. What kind of mark do you want to leave on the world? How can you nurture a deep and active faith that changes your own life and then flows outward to touch the lives of others? And how can you help build a church that's not just surviving but thriving? A church that's a real beacon of hope in a world that needs it so badly.
Remember, your life matters. The choices you make, they have an impact. And even in the middle of the wilderness, God is at work. He's orchestrating things for your good and inviting you to join him in building a legacy that will last forever.